Welcome everybody. This is another edition of Localization Explained. And as you know, localization is not just limited to L10N localization. It encompasses so many disciplines: translation, user experience, interpretation, localization engineering, all of that. It all fits in. And why? It's because we're trying to take products, services, and get them to work across the world. Today, we have a very special guest, Alberto Ferreira. Say hi, Alberto.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to have you here. And I met Alberto at a wonderful session he had at Loc-World a few years ago. And the session was about the universal UX experience. So it's great to have you here today and walk us through a day in the life. So the credentials of this man is quite amazing. Alberto is a user research manager at Vodafone, but he's been a lecturer, Think Global, conferences, Loc-World, guest lecturer with a Master of Science in User Experience Design at Kingston University, attended University of Bristol, PhD in philosophy and computer science. That's a pretty interesting mix. And of course, author of Universal UX Design. I recommend everybody go and get that. It is available on Kindle in different forms. And what is so wonderful to have you here today, Alberto, is to talk about the user experience. And when we talk about that, it's user experience for all, not just one country. And I know a lot of us who are in localization, when we talk to people that have the experience of only one country, for example, the United States or the UK, we may be thinking in terms of what we see, but there's the entire world that we can't get to because our browser gives us this experience that's limited to our country. So there's different ways to see the other parts of the world through your browser, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Alberto has spent all this time lecturing and talking about all of these things in universal UX design. Because we know visual design, interaction design, accessibility, usability, they affect the user experience. But do we take global cultures and language into consideration? Alberto, we'll talk about some of these interesting concepts that the user experience may rely heavily on Western influence primarily. Can you talk about your findings in how do you get past just the Western influence?
So it depends on where in the world the product or the website is being developed, because there's a huge, potentially bigger industry for UX in China, as well as Japan, for example. And the way that they develop things are innately for the target audience, and it's uniquely targeting their own culture and their own preferences. So it depends a lot on where in the world you're actually developing. What I find is that in terms of UX, we have two different strands that are kind of fighting each other in terms of dominance for in terms of the larger trends. One is that UX tends and is becoming more and more globalized in a way, because the paradigms and the design standards that companies like Google, for example, are promoting, or Apple are promoting in their respective operating systems, end up conditioning and guiding a lot of the design that is done for those platforms. Same thing with Windows. So there is that particular stream where design is getting more and more uniform, standardized, and using more and more of the same kind of approaches. And then there's the aspect of experimentation and being more targeted towards a local audience, which is something that is bigger in certain markets than others, especially if they have an international audience as well. So I think that in one way we run at the moment, there is this aspect of the local markets not being catered for enough if the company doesn't have a very strong or very effective position in that country. So there's lots of horror stories. We'll talk about a couple of them today as well, in terms of companies that didn't make the transition to an international market properly. But I think that in terms of global trends, we do have those antithetical kind of positions where we have, on the one hand, live standards that have come to regulate design, and on the other hand, the experimentation, then the uniqueness, the specialization of design as well.
Excellent, excellent. And what can go wrong? Oh my gosh. And it kind of depends on what the product is. So we have some classic examples, I'm sure. So we're talking about influence of different regions of the world. And we know accessibility is a big consideration in UX and in many different design disciplines. Does accessibility include language and culture? Is technology universal? Can you talk about that?
Technology is universal in the sense that every culture, every human culture has technology up to a point. Technology is not just electrical gadgets. Technology is tools and what we do with them and what we apply them in. Accessibility is one of the aspects that complicates user experience in a way, because it's about inclusivity. It's not really about culture, but it's about making sure that everybody has fair access to, for example, a website or service, and that is a huge factor these days into, for instance, and one of the drivers as well for interfaces to become increasingly simpler and move towards more standardization, because you want everybody to have access. I mean, for example, recently my team has been conducting some tests and research with people with dyslexia and ADHD and different cognitive conditions that change the way that they access an app or can read something on the screen. And what we saw was that things that we normally wouldn't think of, like the density of text on a page, made a huge difference for somebody with dyslexia. You read through terms and conditions, if you would, because most people just skip through them. But if you would read through that, the density of the text makes a huge impression on how readable it can be for people with those kinds of conditions. So it's accessibility is part of universal user experience. It's not necessarily cultural in that sense, but it is something that affects all cultures for sure.
Thanks, yeah. And well, and it can be so simple if you don't put in the language tag at the top of the head content of an HTML file. The reader, if it reads it, will say merci beaucoup instead of merci beaucoup. Okay, so very interesting. Now I want to share my screen real quick, and we have a couple of things to show. And let me get into the share. And it's going to be into my thing. Now this is interesting. Whenever we talk about why is this important, I love to bring up, this is kind of an ugly, old-timey type of graph, but if you go to internetworldstats.com, I've been watching this since, the year 2000 when they started, and it's interesting to see. This is why. There's some huge numbers here of where is the world looking at in terms of internet usage. There's a graph up here where it says Asia, 53.4 of the internet users distributed across the world. That's over half. Europe is 14.3. Look at North America, where we are, 6.7. We're number 5 now. That's kind of a sobering thought. And notice Africa's this chart's really interesting because of the rate of growth is tremendous. 13,000, over 13,000% growth in 21 years. So in going into this, I want to show the image here. We're going to speak about the Tesco, talking about Western influence. What was your finding on this, Alberto?
So Tesco, if anybody is not familiar with them, they are one of the biggest, and for a few years back, they were actually the biggest supermarket chain in the UK. And they had a vision towards expanding in China as well, and starting with Shanghai in particular, which is traditionally quite accessible point of contact for international companies seeking a foothold in the Chinese market. And their approach was that they needed a USP. They needed something to distinguish them from the other brands. So obviously in the UK, there's this whole thing around loyalty cards. So you, as a customer, you get discounts, you scan your card whilst you're in the cashier, and you get some points, you get some small discounts. It's something relatively low effort, but it does increase the level of loyalty as well. And they use that in China as a way also to distinguish themselves from others. But what they didn't understand at the time, and the agencies didn't actually tell them, was that in China, apart from being a very, very competitive market in any industry, but there's very low customer loyalty when it comes to supermarkets. There isn't this view of a brand as something that is to be returned to over and over again. And actually quite a few, more than 63% at the time, so this is already 2 or 3 years old, had loyalty cards for 4 or more retailers. So the loyalty just wasn't there, and that wasn't a USP that they could use. And coupled with the fact that they were also not exactly catering to the local market in terms of the products that they were selling, they still had a lot of preferences, Western preferences, reflected in the way that they stock their shelves. It all spells pretty much disaster for the company in that market very soon. And effectively, up to this point, I don't think that they've managed to come back to China and gain any kind of market share.
Very interesting. And of course, when you go to the UK, you see Tesco everywhere. But if you haven't had a chance to go to visit London or the UK, you might not know about it. But it is interesting because, you know, the UK retailers are Europe thinking, perhaps, because they're in Europe, but then trying to expand to Asian countries. It seems to be the big promise, but you really have to pay attention to how you're doing that. So yeah, okay, thanks for that example. And then also, I'm going to stop for a second with the share. Along those lines, whenever we look at, speaking of looking at the world with those kind of eyes, whenever we look at specific examples, one of my favorites to just open the eyes of everyone. Let me do the share one more time. When you do a simple test, all you have to do is go into Amazon and instead of .com, type in CA. And when you do that, you get to see the Canadian experience. I've actually used this as an eye-opening experience to help people see, well, how do they do their shopping carts? Well, take a look. They don't use states, they use provinces. And what's a really fast way of checking to see a different user experience, just take a look. They have a decimal comma, they have Canadian dollars, and you can go all the way down into .de, and look how German layouts are set up. And then you can see all the way into .cn if you really want to see something completely different and get a little bit different of a world experience. And there's simplified Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next thing to show, let's see, in our notes here today, we're talking about some important things in the different talks that I've gone through, kind of doing some research on you, Alberto. And the statement that stood out to me when we met, you were saying that it's important that UX, the user experience of all, gives it equal standing. And I'm going to show a couple of your workflow and your presentation slides. Can you explain before I start the share what in equal standing and how?
So that actually has different interpretations. So within the enterprise environment, typically localization is seen as a tail end of a development or design process. It's not typically put at the core of what the design or user-centric design should be like. And that's a major mistake once you go into specializing that experience for different markets. So in a way, it's something that I think speaks also to the way that the industry is very much geared towards delivery and implementation and execution, and lacks that part that is more global, more towards the design, the product design part, which is something that shows in pockets but doesn't exist as a movement yet. But it's growing, and that's really gratifying. So the point about existing in equal standing within the enterprise environment is really around the fact that localization should be brought in and should be considered at the very early stages, actually, of product development. And I'm not just talking about website and app or the traditional online experience, but also in terms of product design, because a lot of the companies that we work for are developing actual physical, tangible products for markets. And that's also in a lot of ways a globalized experience. But things like the usage, like the understanding of the customer base in the markets that the company is working in, that's all things that localization should be linked to. So the equal standing part that I was referring to is really to the fact that localization should be an actor that exists in that enterprise environment with the same kind of importance as a design team or development team. So this here was taken from a workshop I gave a while back, and there's multiple opportunities for localization, even if the environment itself is not necessarily overly friendly. And by the way, sorry if you hear some drilling in the back. My neighbor thought that it was a good time to actually start providing some soundtrack to this. So in terms of, there's different aspects of localization. So we talk usually about localization in the context of content localization. So the translation, proofreading, that even co-creation transcreation is definitely one of the things that localization traditionally specializes in. But there are other aspects that are equally important. Like, for example, if we're developing content, and up to a point, everything that shows up to the customer is content in an online setting. If we're developing that, we need to understand the audience. So why should, for example, only user experience or marketing have access to that market awareness and findings? That's something that needs to play into localization. Similarly, localization shouldn't have its specialized materials in that sense, because they need to work across teams. And that awareness of local market is something that you should have as part of the world of localization within the company. And then you have the other aspects which are also connected to internationalization, which is the design localization. And this is very much three factors that play into adapting localization to an already existing product or an already existing process. What I've what I've been learning over the years and interacting with design teams and development teams and product teams quite closely is that there is the whole aspect of moving upstream, of designing things correctly or as well as possible anyway in the very beginning, like when you do your workshops, when you do your market researches. Those are phases that already localization should be involved in, because style guides, content, customer profiles or personas, all of that are artifacts that will help localization further down the line. And if localization is not aware of those at the very beginning, it'll be much harder to do a good job once it actually gets to the localization stage. So that's just some aspects that are overlapping between what we would think of design or user experience design and localization. The similarities and the connective tissue is actually much stronger than we normally tend to think.
Very nice. And I think the localization people in the audience really can benefit from this. And then the UX people can see, okay, there is correlation, there is overlap, and we can work together. Very good. So thank you for providing this image. Okay, so now what's interesting, we've talked about user experience in so many ways of product design, and we talked a little bit about accessibility, but there's an emotional type of response that can be measured. I was surprised to hear about this, Alberto. So I'm going to share your slide presentation here. And please tell us about this study.
Sure. So to give some context, so I worked a number of years in the travel industry. And one of the challenges that we always had was, how do we understand what is going through the minds of the customer whilst they're booking their trips or their holidays? Just something that everybody would like to be doing and would like to be involved in at the moment as well. And one of the challenges that we had was, is the experience of booking a holiday different for a British customer versus a Saudi Arabian customer, because we had operations there. And the whole point of this study was using a galvanic skin response sensor, which basically is like a Fitbit, but a little bit simpler. You can just generally get these devices fairly easily. What we were doing was using a research technique of elicitation. So basically, we were getting people to, through images and retelling their story and building a rapport there, to relive their booking experience. So how their holidays get booked. And what we did was, we got the same kind of research method to be used for both the British and the Saudi Arabian customers. And we measured the peaks and the valleys, basically, in the galvanic skin response. So basically, when you have an emotional response to something, the water content, basically the sweat glands in your skin, start to perspire a little bit. And most of the times you don't notice. It's not the case where you'll be sweating all over, but just a little change in density is enough to signal a change in the in your emotional status. So that was what we did. We got people to retell their story, measured their galvanic skin response levels, looked at the peaks and valleys, and then compared with an average between the British and the Saudi Arabian customer base. And if you scroll down to the third slide, what we did then was to map these out along the timeline. So basically, from the moment that you start thinking about going on holidays to the moment where you finished booking and you're ready to go on holiday. And what we saw was that, especially the UK luxury bookers were experiencing less stress during the process, primarily because they were more used to it. It was something that was quite effectively part of their experience. Every year they would tend to book the same holidays, go different places, but they were very, very familiar with that process. Whereas the Saudi Arabian bookers, so if you go to the fourth slide, just go down a little bit, you can see that they have, whereas in British customers, at each step, there's a little transition, then there's a peak, and then there's so the peak is when they actually book the trip. So success, yes, I'm going on holidays, and then they goes back down. For Emirati bookers, it was quite different because we saw that it was much more of an uphill battle in terms of booking their trip, and then it was quite the drop after that. And basically, what we were trying to get was some data, substantial data, so something that we could measure in terms of measuring these emotional states. And we saw that there was a significant cultural difference between these types of customers based on how they were booking their holidays. And that's obviously what we were focusing on at the time. So with that in mind, then we produced a couple of profiles that were meant to help us identify what kinds of qualities and worries and priorities each customer group had. And sorry, Marina, if you go back to the bottom couple of slides. Effectively, we just, using also other data, so surveys and whatnot, we produced these couple of profiles for the design team, which were about the cultural differences of these two customer groups and what kinds of priorities that they have, how did they actually prefer to see their content, what was their social sensitivity in terms of the content and the messages that they saw on the site, because obviously there's lots of imagery on a booking site. So that's one of the things that we had to pay a lot of attention to, is what kind of content works for whom. And obviously this is quite condensed, but we did multiple rounds of this. And really the point was, we can use quantitative data, in this case, GSR signals, to try and identify the differences between different cultural approaches to the same process. And so this was one way that we kind of brought the localization aspect into the design and research phases, because we knew these audiences are different. We're not going to do the same thing for both. We have to find what are these differences and then focus on them for the design. And that's one way that we managed to do this, was to build these profiles based on this method. But you could arguably do the same with surveys, interviews. The important thing is not to forget that different cultural settings have different experiences online, what they're used to, how to use it, what their priorities would be. And that's something that definitely, if your design teams don't know of, then it's localization's job to go and remind them.
Yes, very good. Absolutely. Thank you. That's very interesting to actually detect emotion and how it changes. And that is, the most physical user experience measurement I've ever heard of. Okay, so question then, with all of this, we've talked about the research you've done and this study and such. What we like to do in the Day in the Life series is to ask you directly, walk us through a typical day of a global UX researcher, shall we say. What do you do?
So, for full disclosure, my team tends to focus a lot on the UK market at the moment, but we do work with other markets across the world. So Vodafone has markets in dozens of different countries, and we are always talking to our colleagues in Germany, in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil. Basically, we have a global perspective on what we're doing. And in terms of the day in a life, a lot of it is just, in my case right now, it's a lot of meetings, but what we start the day off really is by looking at what are the priorities for the day in terms of the projects that we're engaged in, whether the priorities have changed. So basically, we do a stand-up, we do a review of where we're at with the projects that we're involved in. These projects can be anything. Could be just releasing a survey to an international market. It could be running some usability testing sessions, which normally involves interviewing. We also have a review of the learnings that we had the previous day. So basically, if we had a round of testing or workshops, for example, we go through those very quickly, so to get the day started. Then it's usually a combination of talking to the product teams and seeing where they are at with implementing the results of what we discovered in the past few days. Normally, we also prioritize projects depending on. So we work on a project basis. It's not just the one product. We support across the company and multiple products, and so that means that it's sometimes quite hard to keep track of it. But in my case, my team is usually split by channel and product, and my job is basically to advise on methodology, support them in terms of what they would like to learn, talk to the product owners, and see. Sometimes the product owners don't know exactly what they want, so you have to actually extract that somehow. So sometimes it gets to be the kind of question like, I'd like to run this past some users and see what they have to say. And it's not like that, because we have to ask questions of the users, and it's not just like, what do you think about this page? Usually it's more like, so if you're shopping for this product and you're going to this website, is this actually what you expected to use, and what kind of requirements would you have here? So there's a lot to it. And we also take a look at, so right now, for example, we're developing Mindsets, which is a tool to help us profile how customers go and shop with us across different channels, but with a different mentality. So some people, for example, might be super savers. They come and they want to get the best deal, get the best prices. Other people might be more tech heads. So because we're a telco, that means basically that they are looking for the latest phone, and they don't care so much about price. They care more about that experience of technology. So we're working on that, and on a daily basis, we're reviewing the results for that as well. And really, it's a matter of keeping the gears churning in terms of supplying data to the teams, taking new requests, prioritizing these, making sure that new requests get also the support that they need. And so talking to our international markets and seeing what they have learned, because sometimes we release the same product across different markets simultaneously. So when we look at their experiences and when we engage with their research, we get to learn quite a lot. And obviously that informs, and the other way around as well.
Excellent, yeah. And when we get into the Q&A here pretty quick, we're going to see we have one of the attendees has a similar experience of releasing in different markets with a different user experience, of course. So interesting, and so it's not just a matter of, let's just do A/B testing, throw a couple of different A/B, and there you're done. It's more, of course, than all that. So
Yeah, just to say, actually, analytics play a huge role in what we do as well. So it's not just qualitative research that we do. We definitely, on a daily basis, we also talk to analytics to know how the behavior on the site was. The A/B testing is a part of that, but it's very easy for companies and teams to fall into this trap of let's test something by putting it on a website, A/B test, and then see which one wins. And most of the times it's inconclusive. It might be too small and nothing actually changed in terms of the conversion. So then people are like, oh, well, I guess that we'll just leave it, or we'll take it back. And the thing about A/B testing in particular, is that it needs to be strategized with strong hypotheses that usually come from research. So if you know what the customers are asking for, then you can advise analytics or the A/B testing team to this hypothesis has a good chance of performing because customers have asked for it, or this hypothesis doesn't because we didn't get that feedback. So you can advise also on A/B testing directly that way.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a very interesting day that you have there, and I'm sure you've got the whiteboards and all that going. And then this is interesting too, because think about it. We have people that are UX students, people that are UX professionals, localization people, and it seems like there's a commonality of sort of like justifying your existence in a way because UX is so important, we know, and localization is so important. But it's those metrics that really show what the value is. Because we could show slides all day of, well, this person got really nervous when they were doing something and they responded with joy. But then when you look at, okay, we do a tweak and you get more money, you sell more, you have more interest, and the brand is very strong with just that attention. I find that really interesting, and I think that's one of the best values you have in this whole discussion. So then through the years, you've touched on an idea that's based in the future. And what was your thought on that about all these years and all of this work? What's your take for the future? And then we're going to see a couple of your favorite mistakes, errors, and what did you do to resolve?
The future of UX, you mean, or
Yes,
localization, or
of it all, with your emphasis and you having the vision, what do you see?
mm, so obviously I'm not a fortune teller, but I can risk a couple of predictions. Um, I think that the direction that we're in is very much of making sure that every last human being on the planet is going to be connected to the grid in some way. Um, Digital inclusivity is a big topic, and it's already in a way taken over our lives in many different quadrants, and I think that it's only going to continue. I think that automation and ubiquitous computing are also going to take the force. So basically, you go into a room and the systems, the sensors are going to take care of the temperature for you, are going to take care of the air quality for you. um, I think that we're heading in the direction where there's more computing and less human intervention. And in a way, I think that UX is going to be primarily for communication. So the same way that we have social media right now, for example, UX is meant to be so the UX of a social media site is basically how you interact with other people. So that that makes sense for UX. It needs to be designed in that way. But for everything else in your life, from self-driving cars, any type of technology that you use on a daily basis, UX is going to be as transparent and non interfering as possible. And I think that's the direction that we're very much going in. Is the keyboard and mouse model is still around. Obviously, the phone is the primary source of traffic these days. But I think that the future is going to be around using this technology in much more of a heated way, if you like, but towards bigger things in cities and buildings. And I think that the future of localization is linked to UX as well. I think that the way that we have AI, machine learning, and these technologies slowly taking over the way that we produce, consume, and edit content, I think this is also bound to grow. So localization is definitely not going to disappear. There will still be a firm need for that. Um, I think that it will be linked to those technologies as it grows as well. So particularly AI.
Interesting, yeah. And in the localization circles, there's lots of discussion lectures and presentations of AI coming in and taking care of a lot of the translation and reusing continuous localization and just feeding and learning and just getting better and having that. And then of course the translation community has opinions on that and somehow they work together to get to the future. And so that's another discussion entirely. But thanks for that vision that you have there and what could be. Someday we'll have everything just like Tom Cruise manipulating the air to open files. So super interesting. Okay, so now your favorite faux pas error that was caused, if you can discuss, that you've had to intervene or that you've observed because someone didn't pay attention to the global UX part of the design. What do you think?
There's quite a few. I think that one of the things, for example, that it's very easy to miss out. It's not so much big problems with imagery or cultural faux pas. You do get those every once in a while, but sometimes it's the little things that get that seem to have the biggest impact, even though they're not necessarily at first the most visible. Iconography, for example. One of the things that we found and I experienced in the past, for instance, are the ways that paradigms around iconography change, and they are also different from country to country. So something, for example, like using a trash can for a delete button, which is something that for Japanese culture, for example, is very alien because they don't have trash cans in Tokyo, for example. It's very hard to find any kind of trash can in the city. Normally, they're next to vending machines, and they're meant for the vending machines, so it's almost impossible to find them. So that iconography, for example, didn't actually work with the target audience, or things even like more traditional ones, like for example using a diskette for a save function. If anybody remembers what a diskette is, floppy disk.
Let me think. Trying to remember that. Yeah, and there's no reference today, of course.
Yeah, so that's one example of a paradigm that was lost. It was a technology that was lost, and we're in places I still see a floppy disk used to represent save, and I always find it very cute because it's like this reminiscence from the past. But sometimes it's the small things like that. And you do get complaints from customers, but normally if you're doing a good job with the deployment of the content, the bigger issues are not so much an issue. But for example, things like there's idioms, obviously, and everybody's got their fair share of them. I mean, probably one that I remember very well being, for example, in the original we had it was a medical instrument, and in the form it said the medicine, when the medicine was off, and basically that meant, we assumed that it meant that when the patient was off the medication, but actually what it meant was that the medication wore off. And when we translated that incorrectly, that was a major deal. So that was a major problem. And sometimes it's these idioms that really get to you, but in that case, it was an actual mistranslation that was significant. But this big and small, it's just those small things that get to you most of the time.
Interesting. And and besides the fact, if you have medicine and you have a system that dispenses, medicine, and it's calibrated to the decimal point of the US, but it's used in France that uses a comma instead, or a space for the thousands, people can actually die. So, okay, so it's time for the Q&A, and we have a couple of people already have given some questions, and then we'll open up to everybody else. First, let's start with Adele. Alberto Gonzalez. let's see, your question, you were saying that your experience with Walmart, you have different product lines, and so you have a different user experience. And oh yeah, thanks. Anybody that has some comments to put in the chat about their quandaries and things that they've discovered in their work, go ahead and put that in the chat to share. And so, Adalberto, you had said the other day you were asking the questions for this purpose here. Let's see, your question, there we go. How much should you already know about your international customers' needs and current behaviors in order to set the right hypothesis? Thanks, Adele.
Good question. It depends on the project. So if we have the benefit of having already a team in that market, normally they would have some work already done, so they will be a treasure chest of insights on the market itself. What we do in particular is to try and not reinvent the wheel. So if there's good profiles or personas or mindset information that we can use already, we use those. If you're just starting off and you don't have that knowledge of what's going on that market, then we conduct specific research. So either normally the rule of thumb is to have some interviews with customers from the local market. We might actually use the team there to translate or to conduct the interviews themselves, because obviously the language is a big issue when you're doing an interview and you want to make sure that the person that you're interviewing is as comfortable as possible. Or a survey, for example, which with a wide audience is also quite useful. So we try not to start with too many assumptions. We don't go into a market thinking, oh, the Chinese market is like this or the Indian market is like this. We try to look at the data, what they know already. Normally, even if you don't have a research team on the market, normally you have marketing, and they would have some insights to share with you already. So first, it's checking with the local professionals, local teams, local contacts, seeing what they have and what they know. And then, if need be, conducting specific research. If we're tight for time, or if we don't have too much of an ability to do that, budget-wise or anything, sometimes it gets in the way. We would just actually test the stimuli, which normally is the website itself, and just recruit people to either from the market itself, the team in the market itself, to do the testing with us and try to cut back on costs that way, but also to make sure that they stay engaged. It's very important to engage the local context that you have there. I would say that solves quite a lot of the headaches that you can have around that.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. Adele, you want to turn on your camera and you can ask your question directly. Adele.
I agree with, having a blank slate once you go and start, drawing up your hypothesis. Now, just to follow questions, when you have these type of findings, is it how much influence do you think the UX team can have on the organization's, global business and product objectives? It's, you have your two sides. You have your user findings and goals, but then you also have your business objectives, in which sometimes, you're in a crossroad, in which what are we going to do? Favor the user or favor the business? In a nutshell, right? How do you influence your business stakeholders into going along the path of having a good user journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm always intrigued in going into companies and environments where there's a clear difference between the business objectives and the customer objectives, because you would think that the business objectives are to keep the customer happy. So business objectives should be up to a point aligned with those. But of course, there's always different priorities, and you have to be sensitive towards what the company is able to do and what the business is able to do. So in improving the journey across an international experience, you can't do it all at once. You have to break it down, and you have to, even from a research perspective, you have to prioritize where your impact can be felt the most. So in terms of the design aspect, because if you're, for example, it depends a lot on the market that you're in. So if your company has the online presence is one of the key channels, then that should be a priority and clear to everybody in the business that UX and UX design are playing a key role there. What happens a lot of the times is that companies don't feel that way. They feel like design is just it's utilitarian almost. And what I found is that it's very powerful when you actually bring customers and customers' testimonies and video in particular in contact with the stakeholders, because as soon as we have somebody on the record and a recording of them saying, I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing here, the site is not letting me do what I want to do, it's very hard to counter that and to say, I don't think that this is quite the priority at the moment. The key thing also is to articulate it with whatever you can leverage from analytics. So conversion, continuance, metrics. If you identify the key pain points on the site and you start showing value by improving those, it might not be like a huge thing at once, but if you start showing value, if we fix this, we'll get a conversion to go up by 1%. If we fix that, it's going to have an impact. And that builds up your momentum inside the company. So there is no one solution for everything, but it's about building that reliable communication and standing inside the company. And it starts by seeing where you can have impact in the short term, and then building all that towards the loftier goals, let's say.
All right. Thank you, Alberto.
Nice.
Thanks, Adele. Nice. Okay. All right. So let's see. We have Craig Marcus. Hey, Craig,
Hello.
you had observation question. Do you have your camera? Hi, Craig.
Hi, good to see
Hi,
you. I had a really good example that I came across recently that I'd like to share. And it does have a moral at the end of this story. So been working on a startup idea in medtech to help simplify healthcare systems, right? So we came up with a patient management platform. And if I could share my screen real quick.
Sure.
No, you have it disabled.
Oops, hold on. Okay. There you go.
Give me 1 second here. Okay. So we're working with development companies, and I think the moral of the story is development companies feel that the technology can handle translations, right? And my first disclaimer is, like, everything I learned about globalization, I learned from Marina. That's a fact. So we're looking at markets in Luxembourg, India, Mexico, and the United States. Okay, so are you seeing my UI here? So there's 3 tabs, well, there's multiple tabs here, but as I started to go through and explain that you can't rely 100% on technology, because technology doesn't understand the context of a word or a statement or a sentence. So when we tested this with doctors, they understood exactly what's under each of these tabs. So chief complaint, why is the patient in the room in the first place? Exam notes, this is the doctor's observation of that chief complaint. And then impression and plan is really the course of treatment for that patient. So then we use the tool, and the development company's like, well, Microsoft will handle all this. And I'm like, I don't think so. Like, we need someone in Luxembourg to sit down with us and understand the context of the words impression plan. So there's a tool called DeepL, it's deepl.com. And I typed in impression and plan, and I already get 3 different results in German. So which one is correct? I don't know, because I don't speak German.
Exactly.
So,
It's not contextually literate.
Yeah, so then I said, well, what if we just go with impression, and then we get a different set of results? And then if I go to just plan, again, a third set of results.
Yep.
So the point is, like, you need a human being from that location and the locale that can understand the context of the wording in your UI.
Absolutely. Yes, thanks, Craig. Deal with that every day. Thanks for that example. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, and keep spreading the word. And that's the thing, that time after time we'll come to these teams and they have all these tools, and it's almost like the curse of Google Translate and other things like that, because those were meant to be just to get the gist of the idea, but has no idea of the context. So of course, if you type in help for your button for your help page, it's in simplified Chinese, it's going to be help, the house is on fire. It's not the characters that a translator who knows the terminology and works with UI has selected for that.
And Marina, I always use the example that you gave me of the Got Milk campaign.
Okay, famous.
I'll let you tell that one.
Thank you. Oh, Craig, that's great. Thank you. So everybody knows the mythology of localization, and the best examples, like the Chevy Nova, and in Spanish, Nova means don't go, doesn't go. And of course, the dairy industry, and this goes way back, and it's somewhat mythology because turns out, I don't think the US Dairy Department actually did such a terrible thing, but the idea is compelling, where they had, the got milk was very big in the United States, so they tried to do the same thing in Mexico. And of course, they did not check the translation, and so the meaning of the word was, are you lactating? Because they didn't check. So of course, everybody in Mexico was appalled, and the idea of this wonderful myth was that they lost a lot of money. But that's what can happen, and especially, Asian names for products are based on phonetic, and when you use something phonetic, it's going to mean something else. And there's lots of examples of what can go wrong. So Craig, thanks for that. And a localization person intervening, having an intervention is always a good thing to do, and it happens with UX as well. Very good. All right, so more questions coming up. Let's see, Claudia Mueller, are you there? You want to turn on your camera? I can just ask your question. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask your question. So Claudia says, imagine you have no resources and you have to conduct UX research besides doing your work as a content designer. What would you do? What kind of UX research would you do? Alberto, what do you think? Oops, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. That's probably one of the questions that I get the most in terms of research, because it's seen as something that is time consuming and quite often budget intensive. And the key thing is to know that research doesn't have to be a big project. It doesn't have to be something like a survey that goes out to 1,500 people and costs about 100K to produce. Research, usually the most accessible way is to just conduct some interviews with people that are similar or would be the profile of people that would use your product and would use those pages. And in particular, conducting UX research, so UX research is quite big. There's a number of methods. If you wanted to come up with something new, you would do a workshop. But if you just want to get a view on what can work and maybe validate a bit of your work around a page or a flow, and work on that basis, then it's usually quite enough to just interview 6 people, for example. Could be customers. You could use your own customers if you could find a way to recruit them. Normally, newsletters are a good way. normally the side of the companies also have a nice little link at the bottom. Why don't you help us with some user research and maybe get a little Amazon voucher or something like that? And the key point is not to feel intimidated by research. Ultimately, it's about having a conversation with your customer or your customer type, and you don't have to have big resources to do that. You do need a little bit of time. So whatever support you can get for that, great. Inside the company, there's always people interested in research. Usually get champions from different sources, so definitely engaging with them. But I would just recommend starting with some interviews, validating some materials, maybe a specific page that you're working on, and starting from there. And then showing that to the stakeholders, very important. Communicate that back to the business. Even if you have no confidence in yourself as an interviewer, maybe you don't feel, oh, I'm not a real researcher, so I can't communicate. No, just everybody is interested in hearing what the customer said or somebody that represents the customer. So use video, show that, and say this is what they had to say about this specific page. Similarly, you can also use it for yourself if you're validating your own materials, but it's very powerful to show somebody reacting to something that the team is doing. So definitely start small and communicate that widely.
Thanks a lot.
Craig, does that answer?
Yes, that's really helpful, because we're a really small team, and that's what we're doing at the moment. And these interviews, but somehow, or sometimes I hear like, oh, but yeah, I mean, it's not all about interviews. It's like, okay, but what else are we doing then? Like, we don't have a lot of resources. So, and I think as well that interviews are a really great, well, the best method just to get a lot also for us, for language wise, how are customers talking? And from there, it's a good start. Just, yeah, sometimes I'm asking myself, is it enough good data I get out? Like, or is there also some risk that you see something that's actually not really what is true?
Yeah, and
That's
I
what.
agree with everything that Alberto said. But my take on it, especially like I'm in a similar situation with you, I don't have access to the users I really need. But when we did, we would call it either guerrilla testing or lunchroom testing. Lunchroom testing came because we were in an office environment that had a big cafeteria, and between 12 and 1, 80% of the company would come down. So we set up a table, even with hand-drawn prototypes, and give out M&Ms. And they would sit with us for 5 minutes and just do a real quick usability test. Like we'd say, can you perform these 3 tasks on these 3 pieces of paper? So like my advice is get any type of research that you can. Any research is better than no research. And
That's
you
true.
use your family too. Like I use my mom all the time.
Yeah.
Don't be hanging out at the malls looking, kind of being creepy and looking for people. Hey, you want to do some testing?
Yeah, do it tactfully.
Yeah, do it. Yeah, and always give coffee cards or something. I don't know. Very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
It was really interesting, by the way, Alberto. A lot of compliments.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. All right. Thanks, Claudia and Craig. So let's go through some more questions. It's actually after the hour, but I would like to keep going if that's okay with you, Alberto.
Sure.
Do you have some time? All right. We'd like to get through a couple more of these questions, and there's always so much. We try to package it down, but I think this has been really a lot of fun. All right. So Naz Azari, you mentioned A/B testing. Can you tell us more about A/B testing strategy for local-based emotional UX?
So here's the thing about A/B testing is that you're usually testing against metrics, and normally those metrics are conversion. So it's like how many people bought your product at the end of the day. And the key thing about emotional, or in this case, emotional analytics, let's say, is that you need to turn those into the metrics that you're going to use. Because you can obviously correlate conversion with emotion and do plenty of studies where you see people get excited, so they are more likely to buy something. But it's not always the case. Sometimes friction works as well. So you don't want to get excited about getting a mortgage, but maybe you are. But the thing is that whilst you're going through the process, it doesn't feel fun. It doesn't feel as exciting. Your excitement comes at the end, usually, when you get it. So it's very tricky to do that kind of evaluation. What normally we do, and I would recommend, is to have a simple emotion-based questionnaire in the site or in the materials that you use. So when people get to the end of their journey, when they finish buying something, or when they actually get to a critical point that you see abandonment, for example, from the site, that you release a survey. Normally, you have some tool on the site, and if not, then your company needs to get one, because engaging with the user directly whilst they're using the website is immensely powerful. And if you ask those questions in that context, you get that immediate perception because they're going through it. So it's not like after the fact when you're testing or before, that there's no stakes. You might go through the same kind of flow for a shopping journey with 6 people, and even though they recognize and they rationalize their experience, they're not going through it with the same kind of emotional engagement that normally you would get from having somebody actually making the purchase. So going into the site and having that type of survey released on critical and very, very strategic points can help you to build this emotional framework of where people are at when they use your site or your app. And from that, you can then see, do they feel more excited? Do they feel less excited? Do they feel happier or more satisfied or less satisfied? And that can then guide when you do A/B tests. Oh, we did this A/B test in here, and they said they are more satisfied when this A/B test is showing. So then you can make those correlations. So that would be my point, would be just to try and measure it. And normally using something like an on-site survey tool really, really helps to do that.
Thank you so much. That was a really good answer. I actually wanted to add just a smaller sub-question, and that's, do you have any specific recommendation for social impact-based goals when it comes to UX design and localizing it?
Social impact, kind of wider social issues or ethical issues as well.
Yes. So when the goals are beyond just business initiatives, when let's say a non-for-profit or a social enterprise is thinking of localizing a content or a website, and they need to localize the UX, and dollar value is not an option, and their goal is merely focused on social impact. Do you have any specific tips for that?
Depending on the implementation, so obviously this depends a lot on the not-for-profit or the institution itself, but I would not necessarily rely only on online channels to do that. It would be good to also have a view of the people that are being impacted by that service or not-for-profit directly. So, and that's actually more qual. That's actually about interviewing, maybe observing ethnographics. But definitely one good point is to not just, so research is not just about testing sites and apps, but it's also about understanding people's attitudes towards something. So you could, for example, use surveys as well. And that's one way that you can index how impactful you're being, is by, again, talking to the customer. Could be also in a survey format, in trying to see how do they feel about this particular issue after using your service. Is it better, worse, the same? And you can try to actually index it in that way. So it's something that depends a lot on your audience, how you engage with them, but definitely I would say to ask about bigger attitudes and not just about the experience on the site, but that would be again using either interviews, surveys, or even a workshop, which you could also use in that context.
Thank you so much. All great ideas.
No worries.
Good. Thanks, Dennis. Great. Oh my gosh, this is like a workshop in itself for free. All right. Okay, so question, let's see. Stefan, Huey, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey.
Good afternoon. What a fascinating conversation this is. I really like it. There's a lot of good information here. I want to take us back a little bit more into the localization realm, if it's okay. We've been talking
go ahead.
About the research for quite a bit now. I find it's always easier to make product designs with internationalization in mind. And it's a bit more difficult to change the designs when the product's already finished for a particular market, and then you have to go make changes to go abroad. So I was wondering whether Alberto had any experience with the different models and which one he finds is the more dominant one in his experience.
That's a very good question, because definitely for a company, it's always more cost efficient to work from a global template and then just localize it across markets. And that's pretty much what you see in something like Amazon, for example. They use pretty much a global template, and then they specialize certain aspects of it, like they personalize the recommendations and things like that. Maybe more emphasis on deals or less emphasis on products. So it depends a lot on what they do. It depends on what the objective is. The best possible experience is one that the customer is familiar and is expecting and is able to use properly. And in this day and age, when you try to be too different, especially within the same market, but on a global basis as well, you don't expect to see major differences if the app that you're using on your phone was developed in Canada or in Brazil or even in China. Apart from the language, you don't expect to see major differences in the way that things work, the layout, and the way they use menus and where things are. So I think that specializing, it's definitely easier to go from a global template, and I think that a lot of big companies do that. And that was traditionally the model, was we have one template, maybe we specialize a few pages, but largely this is going to be about localizing something that is fairly fixed across markets. And I think that that's still the more dominant model, but it depends a lot, because for e-commerce, it works because e-commerce is all about the articles and what you're buying and how it's displayed and how it's recommended to you. But other services, not really. Not for profits, for example, or services that rely on you having a different experience with the content. They wouldn't necessarily, a global template wouldn't necessarily work as well for them. So I find that in e-commerce, definitely a global template is a traditional way and seems to be the more dominant form. But in other industries, it's a mixed bag, and there's pros and cons to it. I think that localization can work well with either, but definitely for a company, a big company especially, it's much more cost effective to have a global template.
Good. Does that answer your question, Stefan?
Yeah, very, very good. Very, very good. It's fascinating because here again, I seem to detect that Alberto is using the term globalization and localization in juxtaposition, kind of like they're the opposite. And in our world, in the localization world, those two equate one another. And so it's really interesting to see the different angle of that. Does that make sense, Alberto?
Yes. So obviously globalization has it's a charge. I'm aware that it's a loaded term. So when I'm using it, it's not so much with a political sense, but mostly in terms of this, the sense that a company that's going international and has a presence in all over the world, that the the globalization that I'm referring to is how the services get adapted and reused across these different markets. And
I wasn't accusing you of using it in the wrong way, by the way. It's just interesting that people in different industries, and particularly ours versus yours, have a different twist on the word choice, so to speak. And it's very interesting for us because we're evangelizing about how words mean different things in in different cultures. And in this sense, we're in a different culture. Our culture is the culture of languages. Yours is the one of product marketing, so to speak. So it's very interesting. Thank you for your answer. I appreciate it.
That's cool. Thanks, Stefan. And you know what's really interesting, tying it all together. Okay, so when you think of, you know, translation just translates words. Localization gets in locales and settings and stuff, and then internationalization, a lot of times I've seen the definition is to strip out all of the culturalisms and make it very, very simple so that it can be translated and localized easier. So maybe a template, like you're saying, Alberto. And then globalization, all of it, the circle where it all comes together and everything has its little part in it. So Alberto, I remember what you had said from the past with, I think it was in your book, IKEA has different experiences in the way they do the web, the portal design. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so obviously IKEA is always evolving as well, but in terms of the way that they might emphasize, for example, the self-made nature of their products versus, for instance, reinforcing in other markets different values like family and community, and they have a very, even though it is probably the most, from your session, the most internationalized product, because there's the instruction manual is purely pictorial, it doesn't show any text. And the products themselves are pretty universal as well across the board. It's the online experience and the way that they sell the brand in different markets that really is quite different. And there's definitely a big difference in how, for example, between Scandinavian countries, it's more of an emphasis on the impact on the everyday life, and building the home and building that specific experience on an individual level, whereas in other countries they might invest more and have this communication more focused on family and community. And I think it speaks to the fact that it's the same product, it's the same brand, it's just selling different values, selling itself with different values that speak to the local audience. And in this case, content makes all the difference, even when it's not about the product itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, I think we got through all of the questions, and it is 20 minutes, 22 minutes past what we were planning with you, Alberto. Thanks for your generosity and you know, so much information you've given us. So I think it's been a fascinating chat. I see people putting comments in the chat, really enjoying the whole thing. So again, everyone can save that chat to their individual Zoom experience. So Alberto, we're going to have you back at some point and bring even more people in. There's so many cross teams and you know, cross-pollination. It's so healthy to go in this direction. And I think if there's one takeaway, it's for those, you know, evangelizing these concepts to people that have no access or no vision to other countries, open the eyes, and then everybody work together. So this is Localization Explained, a day in the life. And today it's a day in the life of a global UX researcher. So much to thank you for, Alberto. Thank you so much. Any parting words as we leave today?
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. For those who want to follow up or ask any questions, or if you just want to bounce some ideas, feel free to reach me on LinkedIn. And I hope that at least this has triggered some interest in research as well, if it hasn't been there before.
Absolutely. And please put your LinkedIn into the chat, everyone, and you too, Alberto. And yes, so for more information about all of these kind of things, to talk about it, follow Alberto on LinkedIn, follow me, and I'll make sure that everybody gets together. Of anything, I think one of the best things achieved here is getting everybody to talk together. This is fantastic to have this experience. Thanks, Alberto. See everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Marina.
Thanks, Alberto. Thanks, Marina.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.